Now Charmides comes with his first suggestion for a definition of what sophrosine or temperance is. And that first suggestion is that it's a certain calmness. Of course, as you can see, Socrates is pretty quick to shoot that one out of the sky, simply by pointing out that, at least on a certain take, calmness isn't even good. It's not even something that you'd be happy about displaying. And that's because Socrates manages to bring in examples that take calmness to be slowness, or perhaps even awkwardness. So if you're running and you're doing it very calmly or slowly, is that better than being quick at running? No, it's not. So there is a clear focus here on the negative side of the implications. Also, notice that some of the examples have to do with things that we might say that we have from nature's part as gifts. Other things have to do with things you can train in or become good at through schooling, for instance. And this is very important too, because it's a basic question about virtue in general, and of course sophrosine too in particular. Is it something that just comes from nature or from the gods, or is it something that we can sort of fix ourselves through training or discipline? So that's, although it's not really thematized here, it is part of the background, and that's suggested by the examples. And again, keep in mind this approach that Socrates has when he's refuting this first thesis or hypothesis or suggestion as to what sophrosine might be. Because both the interlocutor, the audience, and the reader can reasonably think that he's being a bit quick. This is a bit one-sided. This is a bit too critical. We might continue on this path and perhaps find something of value. So there is that question there. And I think in part this is what happens in the dialogue too, because Charmides' second suggestion is that sophrosine is a kind of a modesty. Now, modesty here is kind of a basis, possibly, for the idea of calmness that Charmides spoke of earlier. So in a way, whereas calmness is mainly looking just at the external trappings of something or the external signs of something, and thus probably further away from the idea of a virtue as a quality of the soul, then this idea of modesty is closer to what someone's like. Now, of course, again, Socrates is really quick in taking this one out and down. And he does it just by a brief quote from the Odyssey that, for a needy man, modesty is really no good. So, of course, if you're starving, you brink of starvation, then being too modest to ask for a loaf of bread is not going to be, a smart thing for you to do. So there is a way here in which to criticize the idea that it's perhaps too plain, too simplistic, something like that. Also, I think it's very interesting because it's the kind of virtue, if it is a virtue, modesty, that suggests that you're not really perhaps a full-fledged good and noble person looked up to by others. So modesty may be more of a virtue for someone like, or at least, if not a virtue, then at least a desirable quality in someone like Charmides himself, who's very, very young and not, properly speaking, a grown man and a citizen yet, than for such a grown adult and citizen. So there is this aspect that also has to do with the fact that that modesty couldn't, in that sense, be a full virtue, because it's really partly about just the ability to feel shame and the readiness to, for instance, just blush because you've done something wrong or awkward or made some kind of mistake. Now, if what we've identified is your ability to almost respond correctly when you've made a mistake, how is that a full virtue? Because if you had the full virtue, you wouldn't be making the mistake in the first place. So shame, for instance, is very problematic to say is a virtue, because if you're properly virtuous, you shouldn't feel shame, because you would have nothing to be ashamed of. So this is part of the problem with the idea of modesty as it's put up here. Charmides then moves on to a third definition, and of course there are hints in the drama, on the drama level here, that's really not Charmides' own thought, namely that Sophrosyne is doing one's own things. Doing one's own things. Again, Socrates is being very negative and destructive. So, for instance, you should only write your own name. He's almost being absurd in his criticism. And also the example of writing, of course, points out that many of the things we do are inherently social. So writing would typically be, would be with a shared language and for someone else. A message, for instance, or a dialogue. So the idea of writing as an example already points both to this idea of training and socialization and of the social reality that means that it's odd to think of the virtue as being only doing your own thing. And here again, the political level comes in very clearly too, because a city run in such a way that everyone's just doing their own thing just seems not only not too pleasant to live in, but perhaps even more importantly, or more basically, it's an incredibly inefficient and poorly run place. Because think of all the kind of specializations that each individual would have to sort of cater for himself or herself. Anything from making your shoes, to making your clothes, to making all of your food, to all these crafts that you need to have, all the equipment and the houses and all these things. It would just be a place where everyone is really busy doing a lot of stuff poorly and without a proper division of labor, without actually interacting and living together. So on the social level, which is brought in very clearly here, we can see that this is not a good idea. Again, it's not a good idea if it's taken in this way. And this is, again, brings back to the idea of whose idea is it and how important or unimportant is it, whether it's one's own idea. Because here, of course, Critias jumps in. Because probably it's his idea somehow. Or it may not even be his idea originally, but it's something that he may have told Charmides, for instance. That's one possibility, so that it's one of his thoughts or his pet theories, perhaps. And it's not so easy to say from the drama, but try to notice, who does the job of almost enticing or luring Critias in at this point, because this happens now and then in Plato's dialogues, that someone who's at some point just a bystander is provoked or lured into the conversation by those speaking, saying things that they know are going to provoke this person. And this is probably a case like that. So in a way then, we've seen something like a refutation of this very plain version of doing one's own thing, but Charmides' third definition is still formally identical to Critias' first definition, which is, of course, just the repetition of the idea that it is doing one's own thing. That is, in fact, what Sophrosyne is. Now, Critias, once we move over from Charmides to Critias, and of course Socrates is the common denominator here, the things change quite a lot. They become much more sophisticated, but they also become, in perhaps a more negative, in the negative sense of sophistical, they may also become a bit more sophistical. They're often less clear. So it's often, it takes much more work from the reader just to reach the point where you think you understand what they're trying to say and whether you agree or disagree. And the same goes for this opening part for Critias, because what he says is that he has taken for granted, of course, that when he says doing one's own thing or doing one's own things, it's not just anything, but it's what is kalon. Now, this is the same word that we've discussed earlier, that has to do with what's beautiful, what's good looking, what's great or wonderful. It's a very important term in all of Plato and all of Aristotle, and it describes partly describes sort of the greatness and nobility of things that we go for, things that are good. So what he's saying now, Critias, in sort of elaborating on this thesis, is that, well, of course, I never said that, just any making, for instance, would be an instance of this. I make a distinction between doing and making. And what I claim is that sophrosyne is doing one's own thing, not making one's own thing. So this is a discussion, this is a distinction that he sets up here, and that is actually quite interesting. But at the same time, the way in which he does it is confusing, because the authorities and the text that he brings in, they don't even use the same words that he uses. So it all becomes quite sort of, it becomes less clear and obvious. But it seems that this is the main gist of it in this part of his defense for this first definition, namely that, yes, doing one's own things, that is something that's great and noble and beautiful, kalon, because you need to keep in mind that we are speaking of just doing one's own thing, not making one's own thing. So makings can be all manner of stuff, and some of it's probably good and some of it's not, but the way that I think of doing, Critias says, then it'll be something that fits with the definition. It'll be kalon, it'll be great, and it'll fit as a description of what sophrosyne is. Notice also that when we move on now, there's not really a fully fledged refutation. So in a way, things are partly criticized, partly shot down a little bit, but there's also clear continuity. So in a way, what's happening is that Critias is running along to a second definition. In another way, what he at least seems to be thinking or claiming that he's doing himself is just moving on to another formulation of the same basic thought that he's had in a way all along. And his second definition, or reformulation, or modification, or whatchamacallit, is that sophrosyne is doing good things. Now this is in a way just unwrapping part of what was implied by what he earlier said. So this is his second definition. Sophrosyne is doing good things. So what does that mean? Again, from Socrates, we don't get a clear and obvious refutation, but we get difficult questions going in particular in two directions. One of them has to do with value. So what's the good of this for the agent in particular? And that's something that Socrates does often through this text. Whenever it's lost from view, he will bring in the question of what we might call value for the person himself or herself, or for the community, or for others that one is interacting with. Now, of course, the term value is slightly problematic because it's more of a modern notion, and it sounds a bit like something that we have constituted or chosen ourselves, and that's probably not a part of the package in Plato. But let's just stick with the term all the same. It's a good enough term for us to use. The question of value comes in. The second venue along which Socrates asks questions now has to do with knowledge. And here, of course, the question is, so doing good things, is it then part of sophrosyne that you know what you're doing? Do you know the consequences of what you're doing? Is it so that if you don't know the consequences for yourself and for others, then it's not sophrosina and it's not good, perhaps? So these are just ways of making more of a problem and making difficulties, important questions, important difficulties about what it means to do good things, if that is what sophrosina is. From here we move on to the third suggestion, the third phrasing or reformulation or definition or whatever from Critias. Now he says quite bluntly, and this is partly a response to this line of questioning from Socrates, well, what I'm talking about is self-knowledge. Sophrosina is self-knowledge. That's his third definition. Again, there's not been a clear refutation of the previous, nor of the one before that. So in a way, it's like we're partly moving sideways, we're partly unwrapping what was there, we're partly criticizing, and we're partly building up. And with this thesis now, we have reached sort of more or less the half point in the dialogue. We're pretty close to the middle of the dialogue, and I think structurally, in a way, we're sort of at a summit. The clarification that we're talking about here is self-knowledge. It's sort of a central thing, and the rest of the process is going to build on that and elaborate on that in various ways. So this point in the dialogue is sort of in a way, it's the Acropolis of the town built by the Charmides. Again, the way in which Critias does this is this quite different manner of speaking from the short and brief and succinct and clear way that was more the manner of speaking between Socrates and the young Charmides. Now again, it's more of a speech from Critias that's more of a sort of tour de force of rhetoric, perhaps even sophistry, in building up this image. And what he says there is the reference to the famous inscription at the temple in Delphi, which is "Know yourself," gnosis auton, know yourself. And he has interesting things to say about this, because this is then written on the temple, and his claim is that this is what I'm talking about, that's what the god is talking about, and it's meant not as a piece of advice, it's meant as a greeting. I think that this is an important distinction, because a piece of advice has more to do with means to an end, whereas a greeting properly is more of unfolding the end itself. So part of the implication probably of what Critias is claiming here is that self-knowledge and the greeting from the god then, that we are also supposed to use between each other as human beings, is, know yourself, have self-knowledge, not as merely an injunction, but as a sort of a greeting, a well-wishing that's about the end and not the means. Also, we here see then that this is already social. So we have this social aspect that we've been seeing, coming and going throughout the text. A greeting is by definition social. In some rare cases, it's social in the weird sense of being between the god and the human, but it's also, in its fully fledged way, it's social between humans, because that's what a greeting is. A greeting is the initiation of a social relation. So this too is an interesting thing with this suggestion, and tying the idea of self-knowledge to the inscription in Delphi. And of course, it's also a positive and a nice thing in the sense that such a greeting is an attitude of wishing something good for the other or for the others. So there is the social introduced here in a very positive way.